Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. Old-fashioned ghost stories from 1931. Real ghosts I have seen, apparitions vouched for in the writer's experience, phantoms in everyday life. A vast number of people implicitly believe in ghosts and haunted houses, and some of us have had our own quaint and awesome experiences from time to time, writes S. Jackson Coleman. Perhaps the majority, however, do not care to relate these weird happenings to their friends. The reasons are obvious. It is so easy to be dubbed foolish or superstitious. Nevertheless, there are assuredly unaccountable things that happen at times which make us stand aghast and cause us to wonder. I am not a spiritualist and have had little interest in psychic phenomena, yet I clearly recall a stay some years ago at a haunted monastery. A tradition handed down from bygone times told that a certain portion of the monastic building was haunted by a figure habited in monastic apparel and known as the Brother of the Shadow. The monk with a red nose. The monks were prone to consider that the spectre was that of an earthbound Benedictine who had committed in the long bygones some mortal and unconfessed sin. At any rate, one night when the moon seemed to cast almost a supernatural brightness over the famous old abbey, I decided with one of the monks to look a little deeper into the mystery. We wandered into the cloisters together, and everything seemed quiet. All at once, strangely enough, at the midnight hour, we saw a mysterious being standing before us. It was as motionless as a statue. So realistic was the apparition, indeed, that even the Benedictine cowl, which was drawn over the spectre's head, seemed to pierce through my very soul. Fear and astonishment were naturally not decreased when the awesome figure raised its arm and deliberately threw back the head and exhibited a countenance pale as the moonbeams which shone around. What particularly struck me, however, was the nose of the spectral monk that stood before us. Immense in size and of a deep and fiery red, it appeared almost transparent. Indeed, the contrast between the sorrowful countenance and the ruby nose was so great that it rendered the latter doubly conspicuous. The monk seemed to lead us slowly towards the altar of the abbey chapel, which was brilliantly lit with innumerable tapers. And then, as the apparition approached the holy shrine, it vanished completely from our sight. The Grey Cat. Connected with another monastery at which I was once staying overnight was a tradition to the effect that it was haunted in one of the passages by a peculiarly beautiful grey cat. I determined to thoroughly investigate the phenomena. Furthermore, I wanted to do it alone. Accordingly, I meandered down this particular quarter of the monastery at the witching hour, when spectres considered it their duty to manifest themselves. It was certainly a very wild night. Great gusts of wind made even the windows and doors creak as I descended very curiously the old monastic staircase. The surroundings in the dismal passage were rendered still more uncanny by the dimly burning gas jets that supplied the only illumination. All at once I stood aghast. There before me stood sure enough the spectral figure of a beautiful grey cat. Fear soon departed at the sight of so beautiful a creature, which I was determined quietly to approach. That it was alive, however, I became more and more certain as I got nearer the animal. Stooping down, I lifted the cat into my arms, and placing the little creature out of a small window, retraced my steps in the firm and certain belief that I had at last laid this historic ghost. To my complete surprise, However, upon taking a last glance into the gloomy corridor, I saw distinctly before me the spectral gray cat. Next day I minutely and without comment went over the monastery to see if there were any doors or other way by which the cat could have gained an entrance. The search proved fruitless. One of the monks, however, related that this beautiful gray cat, which had been a favorite with Brother John, always appeared on certain nights, and in particular on that upon which he had passed away. Phantoms of today. Instances of phantom trains, phantom ships, and even phantom airplanes have been heard of. For a long time, the road between Rugby and Coventry, I understand, has been periodically haunted by a phantom lorry that emerges from a hedge and crossing the road vanishes inexplicably in the hedge opposite. I can personally recall a strange experience some 25 or so years ago when I was quietly cycling along one of our main roads. All at once I became aware of a coach and horses coming swiftly towards me. They were, as a matter of fact, almost upon me, and I was literally squeezed quite close to the green border on the edge of the road. As the strange vehicle was passing, I took the opportunity, quite unconsciously, of observing all the details: the sable horses with their long tails, the splendid coach with its large wheels and springs, and the long bygone Georgian costumes of those inside. No more surprise, however, was actually experienced during its mysterious transit than if it had been an ordinary vehicle of the 20th century. Immediately it had passed, I nevertheless experienced a desire to see a little more of the out-of-date coach. I therefore turned right around, and then an icy feeling ran right through me, for although the road was straight for a very considerable distance, there was no sign whatsoever of anything on the thoroughfare. Coach, horses, and people, everything had apparently vanished mystically into thin air suddenly as it had all appeared. I gather similar phenomena resemblance. A motor coach can be seen from time to time on the road between Lamberhurst and Frant, near Tunbridge Wells. Only unlike so many other phantoms, it does not confine its appearance to the night, but is also seen frequently during the day. Daylight specters. Another case of daylight haunting occurs periodically on the main road between Swindon and Hungerford, but I cannot vouch for it myself. An exceedingly awesome experience nevertheless fell to me when I was visiting Marlborough in Wiltshire some few years ago. At a most astonishing rate down the thoroughfare to the Kennet and Avon Canal, a steed was heard one night about the hour of 11 galloping. There was a spectral form, but it passed along much too quickly to be identified. The phantom, as I have said, could nevertheless be distinctly heard. Next day a village disclosed to me the legend. It ran to the effect that a messenger of King Charles, when bearing dispatches, was shot on Duxbridge. Returning to Marlborough a few evenings later, I decided once more to listen, and strangely enough the very same thing occurred. This time, however, there was no doubt whatever of something peculiar about the whole affair, for at just the time there was a villager's horse and cart passing. This gradually grew in a natural manner fainter and fainter as it went in the distance, but immediately the spectral horse had reached the bridge, the hoofbeats were no longer heard. They were absolutely inaudible directly the steed attained the scene of the alleged murder. The haunted bedroom. A few years ago, while spending a night at an old countryside inn, which has now made way, most unfortunately, for a more modern and pretentious establishment, I awoke during the night with a rather disagreeable impression that I was not alone in my bedroom. The inn was certainly reminiscent of those bygone and spacious days when the roadside tavern played so large a part in the social life of the nation. But on this occasion, at the foot of my old-fashioned four-poster, I saw standing, to my blank amazement, the eerie figure of a girl. In her outstretched arms was an infant child. Her weird eyes were fixed closely on me as though pleading for help or protection. I begged her to let me know what I could do for her, but received no reply whatever. A moment later the spectral form had disappeared, and to discover some further intelligence or trace of my mysterious visitor, I caused a thorough search of my apartments to be made. Convinced that after all I must have been dreaming, I at length returned to the warm sheets. Again and again, however, I had this unwelcome and weird experience. In the morning I related the episode to the innkeeper, who candidly admitted that the room in which I had passed the night was supposed to be haunted by the apparition of a girl and her baby child, and that other visitors to the inn had been awakened in a similar manner. Whether there had been a murder in the room, or whether there had been any apparent cause for the strange spectre, he was unable to say. A moonlight funeral. Another awesome experience that has fallen to my lot occurred one night, just as I was almost ready for bed. A friend, who had invariably professed an utter contempt for such eerie things as ghosts and haunted houses, arrived suddenly at my home. He seemed greatly surprised to see me. Nothing, however, did he disclose until we had both drawn up our chairs before the fire that had been blazing up the chimney for my comfort for the whole of the evening. When we had become quite comfortably seated, however, he asked somewhat abruptly, "Who is being buried tonight at yonder cemetery? Strange that a funeral should take place at this late hour, wasn't it?" "Tonight?" I questioned in blank amazement. "Yes," he shortly rejoined. "You know all about it." And then, as I looked surprisedly at him, as if to question his sanity, he continued, "When I was on my way home, less than a half hour ago, the funeral passed me at the corner of this very street. Among the mourners, you were there, clearly enough. How can you deny it? I therefore came over to see what was wrong." Again I dissented, with marked emphasis. A moonlight funeral was as much out of my mind as a moonlight flit. "But I saw you," he added once more, "and you nodded at me as you passed." At this I burst into laughter, and tried to persuade him that his imagination had apparently run away with him. He nevertheless remained adamant until the end, and so he remains even to this day. The Guilsborough Ghost, or minute account of the appearance of the ghost of John Croxford, executed at Northampton, August 4th, 1764, for the murder of a stranger in the parish of Guilsborough. It appears that the author, who was officiating there as temporary chaplain to the jail, was a man of indisputable and well-known integrity, and a very popular preacher throughout the county. The Ghost. It appears from the account given in a pamphlet reprinted and sold by G. Henson Letterpress and Copperplate Printer, Bridge Street, Northampton, 1848, that on Saturday, August 4th, 1764, John Croxford, together with three other of the names of Seamark, Deacon, and Butlin, were tried at the Assize of Northampton and convicted of murder. It came out at the trial that the unfortunate victim was a native of Scotland, travelling with goods, and that by chance he called at the house of Seamark, a shepherd's hut in the parish of Guilsborough, Northamptonshire, where Croxford and his companions used to meet, where they robbed and afterwards cruelly murdered him, and in order to prevent a discovery, consumed his body in an oven, which was proved on the evidence of one of Seamark's children, who was an eyewitness to the transaction, by looking through the crevices of the floor from the room above. They were all found guilty and executed on August 4th, 1764, and Croxford's body hung in chains on Hollowell Heath in the parish of Guilsborough, near the spot where the hard deed was perpetrated, and no spot more suggestive of such a tragedy could be imagined. The author of the work at that time, 1764, holding the appointment of the chaplain to the Northampton jail, after quoting passages from various writers to prove the reality of the subject, proceeds to give an account of the appearance of Croxford's ghost as follows. I shall now proceed, without further let or impediment, to a plain and conscientious account of the ghost or apparition, which was the occasion of my troubling the world with this narrative, unless I first observe that the behaviour of the prisoners, one of whom is the subject of these pages, lately tried, condemned, and executed at Northampton, for the murder of a person unknown upon the evidence of Anne Seamark and her son, about 9 or 10 years old, was such as astonished every beholder. Clear and conclusive as the evidence was against them, no arguments, even after condemnation, though delivered and enforced with the utmost energy, precision, and perspicuity by a learned and worthy divine, were able to reach their hardened hearts and prevail for an open and unreserved confession of their guilt. Even at the gallows, in their last addresses to the people, they insisted on their innocence in the strongest terms imaginable, wishing the heaviest penalties an offended God could inflict might be their portion in the next world if they were guilty of the murder that was laid to their charge and for which they were about to suffer. Thus did they divide the sentiments of the crowd, that many were brought over to a firm persuasion of their innocence, while others were left halting between two opinions, and severely agitated with conflicting doubts. But mark the event. After having instructed my people as a teacher in the knowledge of the Scriptures, I used to spend the superfluous hours of the Lord's Day and perusing some part or other of the Old and New Testament. Accordingly, on August 12th, 1764, being the Sabbath, I returned as usual into my study, the door of which is secured by a lock with a spring bolt, and sat down to my accustomed evening devotion. The business of this day by rotation laying in the New Testament, and in that part of it where St. Paul, in his epistles to the Corinthians, proposes, maintains, and proves the resurrection of the body. Struck with the sublimity of his thoughts, boldness of his figures, and energy of his diction, and convinced by the number and weights of his arguments, and looking with a pleasing foretaste of happiness into futurity, I was on a sudden surprised with the perfect form and appearance of a man, who stood erect at a small distance from my right side. Conscious that the door was locked, and that there was no other means by which my visitor could have entered, I was considerably surprised, turning into abject terror, when glancing with irresistible fascination at the man, I perceived in him something indefinably, but most unmistakably unnatural. Feeling sure that I was in the actual presence of an apparition, I contrived by an almost superhuman effort, I admit, to sum up sufficient courage to speak, my voice seemingly dry and unrecognizable. I addressed it in the power and spirit of the gospel, inquiring on what errand it was sent, which was intended by such an application, and what services could be expected from a person of so little note and mean abilities as myself. I must here state that although the spectre had inspired me with so much awe, I did not associate it with anything evil. Every second tended to strengthen my composure, and when it spoke in a voice rather more hollow than intense, perhaps than that of a human being, my fears were instantly dissipated. I was now able to take a close stock of it, and observed that in features, general appearance, and clothes it closely resembled any ordinary laboring man. It was in expression and coloring, only it differed. Its eyes were lurid, its cheeks livid. Raising one extremely white and emaciated hand, it desired me to compose myself, saying that as it was now strictly limited by a superior power, and could do no one act but by the permission of God, I had no reason to be afraid, abrupt as was its appearance, and that if I would endeavor to overcome the visible perturbation I was in, it would proceed in the business of its errand. At this announcement, my heart fluttered with an excitement I found difficult to control. Was the wonderful mystery that had hitherto enshrouded the existence and composition of the unknown about to be revealed to me? Was I going to be initiated into those secrets heretofore denied to man? Eagerly promising to compose myself, and lost to all else save the fascinating presence of my guest, I settled down to listen to anything the phantasm might have to say. The room, I must here state, was lighted by a single, though rather powerful, double-wick oil lamp, which I had always deemed sufficient to illuminate the whole apartment, but which now, and I could not help noticing the phenomena, did not extend its rays beyond the cadaverous face of my intruder, upon which the full force of its light seemed concentrated. Commencing in clear and solemn tones, the phantasm stated that it was one of the unhappy prisoners executed at Northampton on the 4th of August, 1764. A cold chill ran down my back at this announcement, which was intensified when I recognized for the first time that the figure confronting me bore a startling likeness to one of the prisoners it had been my unhappy lot to address prior to his execution. There was the same hair, brows, and beard, black and stubby, the protruding forehead and retreating chin that had so repelled me, the mouse-shaped head, and the broken, unsavory-looking teeth. It was, indeed, the ghost of one of those diabolical miscreants that stood before me, and despite the fact that I was brought up in the strict Protestant faith, I inadvertently crossed myself. The spectre went on without apparently heeding my actions. It had been, so it proclaimed, the principal and ringleader of the gang, most of whom it had corrupted, debauched, and seduced to that deplorable method of life, and it was particularly appointed by Providence to undeceive the world and remove those doubts which the solemn protestations of their innocence to the very hour of death had raised in the minds of all who heard them. At this juncture, excitement overcoming fear and aversion, I hazarded to inquire of the phantasm its name. Its reply, delivered in the same slow measured, almost mechanical tones, as if it were only the mouth organ of some other's unseen agency, was to the effect that its name was John Croxford, that it expressed directions to come to me, directions it could not disobey. It furthermore explained the reason the murderers had so persistently insisted on their innocence lay in the fact that while the blood of their victims was still warm, they entered into a sacramental obligation, which they sealed by dipping their fingers in the blood of the deceased and licking the same, by which they bound themselves under the penalty of eternal damnation, never to betray the fact themselves, nor to confess, if condemned to die for it on the evidence of others, and that they were further encouraged to such measures, since as Seymour himself was a confederate in the murder, they concluded the evidence of his wife would not be admitted, that as their child was so young, they presumed no judge or jury would pay the least regard to his depositions. But as Bootland had but lately entered into a confederacy with them, and no robberies could be readily proved against him, they thought it would appear impossible for one of his age to begin a career of wickedness with murder, it being observed in a proverb that no man is abandoned all at once, that if they could invalidate the evidence on behalf of Butland, it must be of equal advantage to them all, that though disappointed of this view in court, and condemned to die upon the above evidence, they were still infatuated with the same notion even at the gallows, and expected a reprieve for Butland when the halter was about his neck, and consequently, if such a reprieve had been granted, as the evidence was as full and decisive against Butland as against them, the sentence for the murder must have been withdrawn from all, their execution deferred, and perhaps transportation only their final punishment. Though listening to every word with abnormal attention, I became at the same time aware of a strange and uncanny feeling that the identity of the phantasm was but partly revealed to me in the corpse-like figure opposite. What its true and entire nature might be, I dared not even hazard a conjecture. In the pause that followed its last speech, more to hear myself speak than anything else, I could not endure the silence of this thing. I asked if the evidence of the woman and child was clear, punctual, and particular, to which it replied, it was as circumstantial, distinct, and methodical as possible, varying not in the least from truth in any one particular of consequence, unless in the omission of their horrid sacrament, which she might possibly neither observe nor know. I then asked why they had behaved with such impropriety, impudence, and clamor upon their trial, to which it replied, that they had been somewhat elevated with liquor privately conveyed to them, and that by effrontery and a seemingly undaunted behavior they hoped to intimidate the woman, throw her into confusion, perplex her depositions, thereby rendering the evidence precarious and inconclusive, or at least give the court some favorable presumption of their innocence. I next inquired whether they knew the name of the person murdered, whence he came, and what reasons they had for committing so horrid a barbarity. To which the phantasm answered that the man was a perfect stranger to them all. All the murder was committed more out of wantonness and the force of long contracted habits of wickedness than necessity, as they were at that time in no want of money, that they first found occasion to quarrel with the peddler through a strange propensity to mischief for which it could not account but from God's withdrawing his grace, and leaving them to all extravagance and irregularities of a corrupted heart, long hardened in the ways of sin, that the man, being stout and undaunted, resented their ill usage, and his only offence proceeded to blows, that two only, Deacon and Croxford, were at first concerned, but finding him resolute, had called upon Seamark and Butlin, who were at a distance behind the hedge, that they then all seized the peddler, notwithstanding which he struggled with great violence to the very last against their united efforts, nor did they think it safe to trifle any longer with a man who gave such proofs of uncommon strength, that with much difficulty they dragged him down to Seamark's yard, and there committed the murder, as represented in court. I next asked if there was any license in his bags or pockets, that they might discover his name or place of abode. It replied no, that the paper left behind in its Croxford's writing was of a piece with the rest of their conduct in this affair, a hardened untruth, abounding with reflections as false, as scandalous, and wicked, suggested by the father of lies, who had gradually brought them from one step of iniquity to another, beginning first in the violation of morality to the place of purgatory in which they now were. It further declared, a statement that interested me greatly, that though their bodies were unaffected with pain, their souls were in darkness, under all the dreadful apprehensions of remaining there for eternity, far beyond what the liveliest imagination, while influenced by the weight and grossness of matter, can conceive, that their doom had been not a little aggravated by their final impenitence, impiety, and profaneness, in adjuring God by the most horrid imprecations to attest the truth of a palpable and notorious falsehood, and by wishing that their own portion in eternity might be determined in consequence thereof. Language, the apparition said, was too weak to describe an mortality incapable of conceiving a 10,000th part of their anguish and despair even at present, and happy would it be for succeeding ages if posterity could be induced to profit by their misfortunes and be influenced by this account to avoid the punishment of the earthbound. All this the phantasm delivered with such increased distinction and perspicuity, with such an emphasis and tone of voice, as plainly evinced the truth of what it spoke, and claimed my closest attention and regard. And as it seemed to hint that I was singled out to acquaint the world with these particulars, I told it that the present age was one of incredulity and agnosticism, that few gave credit to fables of this kind, that the world would conclude me either a madman or impostor, or brand me with the odious imputations of superstition and enthusiasm, that therefore true credentials would be necessary, not only to preserve my own character, but also to procure respect and credit to my relations. To this the phantasm instantly responded that what I observed was perfectly right and requisite to authenticate the truth of this affair, and that unless some proper attestations were given to accounts of this nature, they would be considered by the rational part of mankind as mere tales, invented only to amuse the credulous or frightened children on a winter's evening into temper and obedience. In short, that they would have no weight and disappoint the ends of Providence, who intends them for the good and benefit of the world. That therefore, in order to encourage my perseverance in supporting the dispute, and it accordingly told me that in such a spot, describing it as minutely as possible in the parish of Guilsborough, was deposited a gold ring which belonged to the peddler whom they murdered, and moreover, in the inside was engraved this single motto: "Hanged he'll be who steals me." 1745. That in perusing it the apparition continued, it, being Croxford, had been smitten with grave apprehensions, and thinking the words ominous, had buried the ring, hoping thus to elude the sentence denounced at random against the unlawful possessor of it, and even escaped the vindictive justice of heaven itself by such a precaution, that if I found not every particular in regard to this ring exactly as it related it to me, then I might conclude there was not a single syllable of truth in the whole, and consequently no obligation lay upon me to take any further concerns in the affair. Engaged in this interesting and all-observing conversation, I suddenly became aware it was very late. The silence throughout the house for the first time appalled me, and I was about to make a movement towards the door to make sure all was safe without, when the light from the lamp once again became normal. With a startled glance, I looked for the phantasm. It was gone. Nor was there any other means by which it could have taken its departure save by dematerialization. Bitterly disappointed, my fear being now entirely removed at so abrupt a disappearance, I sat down very calmly, and in the coolest manner canvassed over the whole matter to myself, reflected seriously on every particular, and was induced to conclude, from the coherence and punctuality of the account, that it was impossible it should be fiction or imposture. I laid particular stress upon the circumstance of the ring, the singularity of its motto, and the minute description of the spot where it was deposited. I considered, moreover, from the test I had made by shutting my eyes, pressing the balls with my forefingers, that I had been perfectly awake, had the full use both of my senses and reason, and was capable of knowing the figure and voice of a man as the size and print of the book I was reading at the time the ghost made its appearance. In short, firmly persuaded of the truth of what I had heard and seen, I resolved on the morrow to search for the ring, and thereby clear it up beyond all possibility of doubt. Accordingly, on Monday morning early, between 4 and 5 o'clock, I set out alone, making directly to the spot the phantasm had described, found the ring without the least difficulty or delay, examined the motto and date of it, which corresponded exactly with his account of it, and fully convinced me of my obligation to communicate to the world the particulars of the whole. With this resolution, immediately on my return, I sat down and drew up the whole conversation, as near as I could recollect, neither omitting nor adding any circumstance of consequence in the matter you now see it, and trusting it will prove of use to the public for whose benefit it seems intended. The original manuscript, to which the author appends his name, concludes with a very fervid exhortation to piety, coupled with an equally strong warning against indulgence in vice and crime. The story of the ghost, judging by the interest that is even now in 1908 taken in it, must have created a considerable sensation at the time. So much so that I think a brief history of the crime, gruesome though it might be, will bear repeating. Prior to doing so, however, I should like to relate a ghastly experience that happened to me, Elliot O'Donnell, in the same neighborhood, August 1904. The village of Guilsborough is on an eminence 10 miles northwest by north of Northampton, 4 miles from the source of the Avon at Naseby, 10 miles northeast from Daventry, 11 miles from Lutterworth, 10 miles south-southwest from Market Harborough, 12 miles east from Rugby, and 76 miles from London. The adjacent country, consisting of large stretches of smiling meadows, dales, and tablelands, is very fair for the eye to dwell upon, and it is only at night, when the shadows from the many spinneys are cast upon the gleaming roads and silent tarns, or when the wind rustling through the elms and oaks sound like the breaking and falling of surf on the seashore. It is only then that the place presents an entirely different aspect to the psychic mind, and one conjures up ghosts. During the period of my early visits to Guilsborough, the history of the village was unknown to me, nor did I for one moment associate it with superphysical manifestations, till I was staying at the hamlet of Cretan, some 3 miles distant, and had to tramp home late at night. I must confess, then, that I was unquestionably glad to leave the crossroads at the top of Crow Hill and the lonely turnpike behind and find myself snugly ensconced within the very material precincts of the Cricketer's Arms. The route I took led me past the long disused burial ground of some nonconformist fraternity, a spot one never seemed to notice by day, but which struck me as singularly eerie at night. On this particular night in question, I did not leave my friend's house in Guilsborough till close on 12, an hour when all village folk are in bed and the place is wrapped in the most profound silence. The sound of my footsteps as I briskly pounded down the road echoed and re-echoed through the village. I welcomed the sound. It was nice to have even that for a companion. I am not as a rule nervous. I have been too much by myself in life to be an abject coward. Yet, I must confess, I never anticipated the walk from Guilsborough along the lonely turnpike road after nightfall without an uncomfortable itching in my back. I was just beginning to get that sensation when I arrived at the rusty gates of the cemetery, and was confounded beyond measure on seeing a curious, grotesque sort of creature climb over the iron bars and confront me. The moonlight was so powerful that it left nothing uncovered or concealed. A frightful terror laid hold of me. What, what in the name of heaven could it be? Gazing at it with a fascination as hideous as the thing itself, I took in every feature, the long loose limbs, the thin body, the huge hands and feet, the little repulsive head, the white fulsome pig-like face, and the protruding sapphire eyes. For some seconds, to me an eternity, we watched one another in breathless silence. The elemental, for as such at length I recognized it, being the first to take the initiative. The unfathomable stare in its eyes gradually deepened into a horrible and very unmistakable expression of malignant joy, in which all the most undesirable of human vices seemed blended. Its monstrous hands rose like wings on either side of its head, the fingers twitching convulsively in greedy anticipation of clutching me. Its legs slowly crouched as if about to spring, and then, just as the crucial moment arrived, and the acme of my terrors was reached, the spell was broken. The leaden weights fell from off my feet. My limbs became endowed with a thousandfold their natural elasticity, and turning around, I fled. So ended my first and only experience with the Guilsborough ghost. I have taken very good care since then to give the burial mound a very wide berth after nightfall. But now comes the most extraordinary part of it. I had heard off and on that a certain house in the village, since pulled down, was supposed to be haunted. That one bedroom in particular had struck those occupying as containing an invisible presence both inimical and horrible. I never, however, associated this mysterious something with the elemental I had seen till in the course of a conversation with an old and highly respected inhabitant of the village a few days since, August 10th, 1908, I learned that he had a psychical adventure of a somewhat extraordinary nature in his boyhood. Upon pressing him, he told me that he had lived in the haunted house as a child, and on running upstairs to his bedroom one morning, had seen a long, thin human form with a tiny head and animal's face, crouching on the bed and staring at him. Terrified out of his wits by this unexpected and startling spectacle, he remained glued to the spot for some seconds, until a slight movement on the part of the elemental broke the spell, and I was able to bolt precipitately from the apartment. This was the only time he saw it. Here, then, surely was the key to the nature of the haunting. An elemental or poltergeist, assuredly the same that had appeared to me some 50 years later at the gate of the old burial ground. My informant, by the way, had not heard of my experience. I had told it to no one. Hence this visual occult manifestation of mine in Guilsborough stands corroborated. But why this haunting? Why this form of apparition? I dived into the history of Guilsborough and discovered that quantities of fossils, trilobites, together with implements of flint, i.e., arrowheads, javelins, celts, the latter popularly known as thunderbolts, have been and are still found in various parts of the village and in the gravel pits of the adjoining hamlets of Northoft and Hollowell. That tumuli yet remain in Guilsborough Park and in several of the neighbouring fields, and that numbers of very ancient bones have been from time to time dug out of the soil in all parts of the village. All this is conclusive evidence that Guilsborough is far older than its average inhabitant of today imagines, that it had been alternately the site of Paleolithic and Neolithic settlements, and that all sorts of barbaric rites and ceremonies have been conducted on the very ground where houses and cottages now stand. Hence, it is not very surprising to any one at all versed in the modus operandi of phantasm and psychic phenomena to hear that one of the apparitions, at least haunting Guilsborough, appears in the form of a subhuman or subanimal elemental. Superphysical manifestation of this kind, let me explain for the benefit of the inexperienced, usually occur on the sites of or near ancient and unconsecrated or long disused burial places. The whys and the wherefores of which I hope to dwell upon in detail will be found in a subsequent volume.